You're listening to Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self, a podcast about wilderness Christian mysticism. I'm your host, Stephen Hatch, a contemplative living in New Mexico and former faculty at Naropa University. For over 45 years, I've been leading a simple lifestyle, combining family life with meditation, silence, and solitary time in the great outdoors. Along the way, I've developed an outlook rooted in Christian spirituality, informed by the world's great mystical traditions, and inspired by the wisdom found in nature. I'll be joined by my co-host, Will Warwick, also a contemplative, nature lover, and religious studies scholar. This podcast is for kindred mystics, lovers of nature, and people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. It's for those who are genuine seekers of truth, goodness, and beauty. And it's for those who want to live a more authentic life. Please join us as we explore the vast landscape of this contemplative tradition. People often ask if in the Christian mystical tradition there is a method of sitting meditation, and indeed there is. There are two methods. One of them is called contemplative prayer, and the other one is called insight meditation. And today I would like to talk about what I call wilderness contemplative prayer, and another session we'll talk about wilderness insight meditation. But it's interesting, back in the 1980s, I studied under the care of a monk named Thomas Keating, Trappist monk, and he and two other Trappist monks had developed a method called centering prayer. And I found that it brought me a sense of deep rest in my life that I had not known before that point. I had always wondered before, well, who's the true self? Is it my thoughts? Is it my emotions? Is it something else? And Thomas taught me that as I could sink deeply into my being and let go of my thoughts and emotions, I would discover a deep center of peace that actually was my true self. So basically, the method of centering prayer was one where you would set aside about 20 minutes to go into interior silence. You might start out with a little bit of meditative reading, and then gradually you would allow yourself to sink into a comfortable position. You would choose a sacred word that would symbolize your intent to rest in God. That is the main phrase that Thomas had used to speak of contemplative prayer, was resting in God, resting in your source, resting in the ground of being. And every time you would notice your attention becoming hooked on a thought, you would let go of the thought, you would return to the sacred word, a word like peace or rest or God or love or let go. And you would return to that word and then sink deeply into the silence again. It was considered a prayer of intention, not attention. So you intended to go deeply into the depths of your being, and even if you got hooked on thoughts, you just realized, well, your intention remains, and you would simply return to this sacred word, which was like a pointer moving you into the depths. So Thomas would talk about how the two levels of attention would develop at once. On the one hand, a deeper level of attention was you were drawn like an iron filing to a magnet deep within your being in the silence, and that was the deepest level of attention. At the same time, peripherally, you'd be aware of your thoughts that were rolling by in the more superficial layers of your being, as though you're in the depths and far above you, your thoughts are in the sky above. And so you would do this for 20 minutes, and then you would return to a sacred word whenever you would feel attracted to one of the thoughts to hang on to it. Otherwise, you would just let the thoughts keep flowing by. For Thomas, the fruit of the prayer was in everyday life, where you were enabled to let go of your thoughts and emotions much more easily, and then you would manifest more love in your daily life. Well, I practiced this form of centering prayer for 5 or 6 years, but realized that really I was attracted to the images that were used to describe this prayer. And a lot of them came from the natural world. One of the images that Thomas would use is that you're in an Asian harbor and your thoughts are like the boats on the harbor, and perhaps the boats are so closely together that you could step from one boat to the next and forget that they're upheld all the time by the harbor water. So he said that centering prayer was like allowing the boats to spread out and then realizing that, well, up comes the awareness of the water. And so you would start to identify more with the water in the harbor than you would with the boats of your thoughts. Also, he used other images of being drawn deeply down into your center by God. Even the term centering prayer came from Thomas Merton's quote, where he said that in contemplative prayer, you move deeply into your inmost center, and from there you pass into God. So I found that I actually really enjoyed the images and started to develop some images that came from nature on my own. And I discovered that, well, actually, in the Christian mystical tradition, one of the chief images was that of an inner abyss, or an inner canyon, you might say. And so I began to explore this. I realized that there's a sense of awe and wonder that came in this form of meditation. As Meister Eckhart says, the more deeply you are drawn into this abyss, you are amazed that all of your thoughts flow forth. Even though you remain in the abyss, all these thoughts come pouring out of the abyss and appear in the sky above. The interesting thing about the abyss imagery is there's about 51 times in the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible that was used in the Middle Ages that used the word for abyss, abyssus or abyssum. And one of the chief verses was in the Psalms, where God is described as clothing himself with an abyss as with a garment. Psalms 41, which says this, "Abyss calls out to abyss in the voice of your waterfalls. All your waves and breakers have swept over me." The image here is that there is abyss deep within the soul, and beneath this abyss in the soul is a deeper one, and that is that of God or the ground of being, and so that you keep sinking more and more deeply into this inner abyss. The imagery was like that of, you might say, a Rocky Mountain trout. If it stays up on the surface, be the experience of all your waterfalls have passed over me. There would be the sense that the fish would get beat up by the cascades and the waterfalls up on the surface. But if instead the fish, let's say a Rocky Mountain trout, a rainbow trout, would simply sink deeply into the pool of the stream, well, the waterfalls would still be flowing, but they would be no problem because they would be occurring on a more superficial level of the stream, while the trout would sink more deeply into that stream. So there's a beautiful image there of just sink more deeply like the trout into the water. Thomas also used the image of a fisherman setting a hook down into the water, which would be a tasty thought or emotion, as he talked about, that you want to grab onto. And he mentioned that, well, it's as though actually this hook that comes down doesn't have any barbs on it. So you could easily simply let it go from your mouth, that is your attention, and then sink back down into the depths. So this abyss imagery was often applied in a kind of ocean context or a lake or river context. But it's really interesting if you trace the history of this abyss imagery in the Christian mystical tradition. It was almost all women at first who used the imagery. And if you think of it, women's anatomy, that sense of the depths within them, and then male anatomy, there's that sense of always going outside into the spaciousness to find God. Women were aware that they could go more deeply within to find this presence of God. One of the first mystics to talk of this was Angela of Foligno. She was an Italian Franciscan mystic of the 13th century, and she made up a verb where she said that in contemplative prayer one is abyssated into God. And she actually said that whatever people call heaven, no one can comprehend except the person who dwells in this deep inner abyss, and that really is what heaven is. That sense of being deeply within your being, and that you're connected to your source, to God there, who she called an unknown no-thingness. So one doesn't know exactly what it is that one is sinking into, but one knows it is a presence of love, it is your source, and it is an infinite abyss of God. And she says that it leads to this sense of blessedness. In the same century, in the 13th century, two Dutch women, both Beguines, they were a monastic community that formed of women who were in charge of their own spiritual lives. One was Beatrice of Nazareth, who spoke of the soul, that is the deepest part of your being like a fish swimming in the vast sea and resting in its deeps. She said, in the deep abyss of God, which is totally present in the abyss of the soul, you learn things that are beyond all of that the mind can comprehend. The second Beguine mystic that talked about this was Hadewijch of Antwerp. She used the abyss calls to abyss passage to speak of a double abyss. She said there's the abyss of the soul, and then more deeply below that is the abyss of God, your source. And she says that each of these abysses longs for the other. There's a kind of bottomlessness. So there is a transcendence of God, where God transcends the soul, but the soul also transcends God. It also has a depth that God deeply desires, and so each of them longs for the other. There's kind of an endless sort of desire, for each longs to fathom more deeply the abyss of the other. So there's very much a two-way kind of relationship and desire in Hadewijch of Antwerp. Now, it's interesting, a mystic that many people have heard of, Meister Eckhart, the 14th century in Germany. He had read the Beguines, and then he used abyss imagery himself after reading them to speak of moving into the deep ocean of the soul where God dwells. He also used a lot of desert imagery, canyon kind of imagery. And then his disciple, Johannes Tauler, even developed the divine abyss imagery even more. For example, Tauler says that in the divine abyss, God, in all of his immensity, brings union about with the soul. Sharing in the divine immensity, the soul then defies all measurements. It's in a state where it sinks into the divine darkness as into a tranquil silence, an inconceivable and unspeakable union. It is absorbed in God, loses all sense of itself, loses all sense of God, and becomes one with the presence of God. So there was a sense of restfulness and a sense of peacefulness in this abyss. Now, Henry Suso, who was another disciple of Meister Eckhart, spoke of this abyss being as though in the mountains. So it was as though in contemplative prayer you go into the interior wilderness of the mountains, and it's there that you find this bottomless abyss, he calls it, and where one experiences union with God. Another mystic named John Ruusbroec, who'd both read the Hadewijch and Tauler, spoke of this as a fathomless love that is craving and insatiable on both sides. So he continues Hadewijch's sense that the divine desire happens between both the soul and God. And he says that we sink into an abyssal modelessness of God, into the divine darkness, and that we sink there into a deep union. Now, another writer who had talked about this abyss in terms of the ocean was Madame Jean Guyon, a French mystic in the 17th century. She says that love is the weight which sinks us. If we were to sink into the sea, and if the sea were infinite, you would fall from one depth to the other for all eternity. She says this is how it is with the soul that is in a place of continuous abiding in God. They are sinking with inconceivable swiftness into the inward depths of God, and that God is like a magnet that draws at the bottom of this ocean, draws the soul like an iron filing. So there's this very beautiful imagery of sinking into the deep ocean. This abyss imagery was passed on to Protestant mystics. For example, Andreas Karlstadt talked of creeping into the abyssal good, which is God, and sinking and then dying to the separate self right into the ground of God in the abyss of the soul. Jacob Boehme, a 16th century Lutheran mystic, had talked of God as the Ungrund, or the unground, or the abyss, and said that we sink deeply into this unground. Later, of course, the Quaker writers used the centering down imagery as what they called contemplative prayer, centering down into the depths of the soul. Thomas Kelly, for example, talked about slipping into that amazing center where the soul is at home with God. Now, many people in our time might think abyss imagery scares them. They might not be familiar with it. So therefore, when I teach this method of wilderness contemplative prayer, I call it the inner canyon. And so I often use, instead of using a prayer word as Thomas did, I often use an image at the beginning of this form of sitting meditation. And oftentimes, like in centering prayer, I will sit for 20 minutes, and I start with an image and then let go of that image and sink into the silence. And I might bring up the image again throughout the method of meditation during that 20 minutes, or simply use a sacred word like let go, as centering prayer does. But one example of how you might do this is to imagine that you are hiking into the Grand Canyon at night, and it's dark all around, and the walls of the canyon embrace you. You feel safe, either because you love the wilderness like I do, or you're with someone and who is also silent with you, and you're hiking into the depths of the canyon, and you sense the trickle sound of the Colorado River from deep within that canyon. And far above you, as you descend into the canyon, the stars of your thoughts and the meteors and airplanes, maybe satellites, all keep circulating in the sky above. And you don't worry about them because you keep sinking down into the depths of this canyon. I discovered early in my experience of contemplative prayer that those thoughts that are like the stars above in the sky above actually add a sense of depth to the silence. Without the stars of your thoughts far above in the sky, you wouldn't have any sense of the depths of the canyon. So many people think that meditation is about making your mind a blank, but it actually is not about making your mind a blank. It's actually moving to a different level that's deeper than those thoughts and allowing them to circulate like those stars in the sky above the canyon rim. As you go deeper and deeper into the canyon, it's as though the thoughts are like a dim light that shines into the depths of the canyon and enables you to see the depths of the silence by contrast. So you don't really want to get rid of the thoughts. If sometimes they disappear during this time of meditation, that's fine. But most of the time, it seems the thoughts just keep on flowing. Teresa of Avila called them the clacking of the mill. She said, let the clack of the mill go on while you grind your wheat. That is, while you go deeper and deeper into the silence, which is what she was referring to as the grinding of the wheat. Just let the mill clack on and don't let it disturb you. Or in the case of this canyon imagery, there's a sense that, well, the stars in the sky actually have a dim light that gives a sense of the depths of that Grand Canyon. And so you just go deeper and deeper into the canyon, and every time you feel drawn out to attach on to one of those thoughts that are like the stars, you simply remember the image of the canyon and you drop more deeply within into that canyon. And you do this for 20 minutes, amazed that your thoughts keep flowing and flowing while you remain in a deeper place. It's as though all of creation is happening before your very eyes. All of creation, all of your thoughts and emotions are appearing out of the depths of that canyon in the sky above, and you are wrapped in utter amazement that such a thing could happen. Now, the interesting thing is that you can use other images as well. I love to go into the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest, and I like to imagine contemplative prayer, wilderness contemplative prayer, being like sitting in a old-growth Douglas fir or redwood forest at night, and you're on a part of the trail where the depths of the trees extends below you, so the trunks go below you into the valley floor below. There's some places in Redwood National Park where I've experienced this. You've got trees right next to you, and yet they're rooted more deeply in the forest floor far below you. And of course, the trail ends up switching back down to that level at the ground eventually. But so picture having your back resting against one of these Douglas fir redwood trees at night. And as you sit there, you realize that if you look up above you, you see the branches, which don't even start till, say, 150 feet up the trunk of the tree. And above that at night, again, you see the stars, the satellites, the meteors. And you just allow your attention to sink deeply into the ground of being. You hear a trickle of a stream below in the forest floor below you, and you just allow your attention to sink more deeply as though you're in iron filing and there's a magnet deep in the forest floor, and you sink deeply into that forest floor, into the ground of being. Meanwhile, in your peripheral vision, your thoughts are like meteors and the planes and the stars in the sky above. You just let them do their own thing. You let them keep flowing while you remain rooted in the depths of your being. So again, you're aware of two levels at once. On the one hand, the depths of your attention are going deep into the ground of your being. On the other hand, your thoughts are on a more superficial level, seen as though peripherally they're like the upper branches in the trees that are around you or the stars above, and you just let them keep flowing on. And you're just amazed that the more deeply you are rooted in this ground of being, in the silence, sinking into that silence, into your inmost center, that the thoughts keep appearing. And the thoughts and emotions just chatter on, or like that flow of the stars. And it's amazing to think that here you're just watching all of creation happening, all of it flowing as though above you while you remain in the depths. So during this time, you don't worry if you get hooked on thoughts. You just simply return to the image of the old-growth forest or the canyon, sink back into the silence, and let the thoughts go on flowing as though far, far above you. And of course, you wouldn't be making your mind a blank because the thoughts serve their purpose. But in this prayer, you don't pay attention to the content of the thoughts. You just let them keep flowing. And the other type of meditation that I'll be sharing in another month or so, that would be wilderness insight meditation. You do pay attention to the content of each thought, and you're utterly amazed as the content keeps changing. You never know what kind of thought is going to arise next. But in this context, in wilderness contemplative prayer, you're not really looking at the context or the content of those thoughts. You just let them keep flowing while your attention is rooted more deeply in the silence. You might compare these two forms of meditation to the Buddhist tradition of shamatha vipassana. So today I've spoken about what might correspond to Buddhist shamatha, which in the Tibetan tradition means abiding, restful abiding. And on the other hand, insight meditation, wilderness insight meditation, is like vipassana in the Buddhist tradition, in which you're getting insight into the nature of thoughts as echoes of the divine presence. So today I hope that you've been able to absorb something of the sense of contemplative prayer and the restfulness of this method, using the canyon imagery, using the old-growth forest imagery, using the imagery of a trout sinking into a rocky mountain pool, using the imagery of sinking deeply into an ocean, while all the waves are breaking up above. Doesn't matter which image you're drawn to, just allow it to seep into your subconscious and transform you. The thing is, we often think that we're the ones that are doing this meditation method, but actually the meditation method is doing us. In a sense, we're drawn into this by the divine presence. We aren't the initiators, and so the divine is at the root of this practice, even though you might think that it's you who decides to do the practice. Actually, you're being led in the Christian tradition by what we call grace to sink more deeply into this restful place. So I hope that you enjoy this method of meditation, and I'll talk to you next time. Goodbye.
Dear friends and listeners, we've come to the end of this episode of Nature as Beloved, Nature as Self. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by liking, commenting, and sharing this episode with others. If you have a question you would like answered, are interested in learning more about a topic, or would like to pursue one-on-one spiritual direction with either of us, you can write to us at natureasbeloved@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram at natureasbeloved. For daily photos and quotes, you can follow Stephen on Facebook or Instagram at the Stephen Hatch Outlook. And for more information about Stephen's books, you can find them on Stephen K. Hatch's Amazon author page. Until next time, may you continue to walk in beauty, be well, and stay wild.